It's true. There once was a dad who was a big old nerd. His depth of knowledge was a bit absurd. Now he's got a daughter who got into the act. Might be smarter than him, as a matter of fact. Two generations with different views. Talk about your favorite topics and spread the news. We go from X to Z. Hi, and welcome to From X to Z.
Yay!
Yay. Hi, I'm Al Morgan. I'm one of your hosts.
I'm Cal Morgan. I'm your other host.
Yeah. And I'm a comedian and a podcaster. I do Mr. Wiggly's Moist and Happy Friendship Garden for Memoriam Development, a sketch comedy podcast. And I'm also an improv player at the Comedy Shrine here in Aurora, Illinois. Cal, why don't you give us your bona fides?
No, not at all. So anyways, my name's Cal. I am an illustrator. Currently, I am an art student over at Northern Illinois University. Though, God only knows with everything going on with coronavirus. No idea, how long that'll last. Yeah, other than that, I'm just kind of a wayward vagabond who likes to throw eggs at houses and cause mischief and mayhem.
Your mother and I are getting a little tired of bailing you out, quite frankly.
Well, you made that decision when you had me.
Anyway, we are both lifelong nerds, and the idea here is we're going to be discussing a different nerd-related topic every week on the podcast from the perspective of our two respective generations. Why don't you explain to our listeners the topic for today?
I would love to. So today's topic is going to be Necromancy 101. The idea behind this is that we're going to be talking about media that brings people back from the dead.
Interesting.
Maybe not literally. You can't really play any of these records backwards and it'll summon a ghost or something,
Well, I can and will touch on some of the efforts of some people to bring people back from the dead via media.
So, Dad, what are some pieces of media that immediately come to mind for you?
A lot of the music I listen to is sound recordings of people who have passed on for one reason or another. And of course, rock and roll is littered with people who died young, but still left a reasonably vibrant catalog of music where you can listen to them and
for sure
hear their voices from beyond the grave, so to speak. And, of course, you can argue that for films and books as well.
Horrifying.
Yeah. Well,
love it.
if you look at it that way, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But more specifically, there have been efforts throughout the years to use some of that technology to bring dead people back into cultural relevance and into new creations.
Yeah.
Such as one of the biggest one I can think of, since I'm a huge Beatles fan, in the mid-90s when ABC TV released a huge documentary series on the Beatles called Anthology. The remaining surviving Beatles at the time, John Lennon had been assassinated back in 1980. He did leave a number of posthumous tape recordings that his wife, Yoko Ono, bequeathed to Paul McCartney.
Wow.
One of the surviving Beatles, in case you've been living under a rock.
I haven't. Don't worry.
Yeah.
There's no way I can live in this house and not know who the Beatles are.
The surviving Beatles took some of those recordings of John Lennon and created new backing tracks behind him, and using various studio trickery such as editing, EQ, compression, all that kind of stuff, tried to make it sound as lifelike as possible.
Wow.
People would say that the results were pretty mixed.
Yeah.
I found it kind of an interesting Frankensteinian experiment.
Yeah.
But, that's just one of the ways in which that has been attempted. People have, and of course there have been things like duets albums, like I know Elvis Presley, who died back in 1977, they've had duet albums with him, with more contemporary, mostly country singers who have sung with him on some of the songs he made famous, and, obviously he never met these people.
Right.
Preeminent amongst classic rock groups who have tried to do this kind of thing, living off the reputation of one of their dead members, would be The Doors. Famous 60s rock band fronted by Lizard King / drunken hobo Jim Morrison. Pretty big back there in the Woodstock days.
That's not how people refer to me when I'm older, as the Lizard King / what was the other thing?
Drunken hobo?
Yes, drunken hobo. If that's not how people refer to me, I don't want to live on this earth.
Well, I'll keep that in mind.
Thank you.
It's good that you pre-write your own epitaph.
You know. Like to have things prepared. But yes, continue.
He died in 1971,
okay.
So back when, they were still in their mid-20s, late 20s. And
is he one of the 27 Club?
He is one of the 27. He's one of the founding members of the 27 Club.
Good for him.
Yeah.
Not good for him.
No,
He died
not
very
good
young,
for him.
but
No,
also,
he did die very young.
got to be famous for something, right?
But they have been remarkably versatile about essentially pillaging his catalog for little scraps and bits and pieces throughout the year. He was also considered himself a poet. If you consider lines like, "We need great golden copulations" to be poetry.
That's like the poetry that people write when they're stoned out of their mind and wake up the next morning and say, "Oh, Jesus Christ, that doesn't make any sense." But then, of course, you die at 27 and your friends find it and they're like, "Oh, he was such an artist."
Yeah, well, yeah, that was the 60s, so...
Yeah.
So, but he recorded, some reels of his own poetry back in the late 60s, but they were getting a little bit desperate because 7 years had gone by and the well had run dry in terms of what they could issue of his.
Yeah.
And so the remaining Doors went back into the studio and recorded new jazzy backing tracks behind the poetry.
Wow.
Yeah, some of it worked, some of it not so much. Yeah. They've also done things like gone back into the vaults and released a lot of live tapes, but they've taken rehearsals, which weren't even meant to be heard by an audience, and re-recorded backing tracks and backing vocals and stuff like that, and re-edited them to put them together. Then, of course, they've taken bits and pieces of his vocals, and there was a tribute album called Stoned Immaculate back in 2001 that was basically full of bands doing Doors covers, but also the Doors themselves just taking Morrison's vocal sample phrases and constructing entirely new songs out of them.
Wow. Yeah. So. It's funny because when you talk about that, my current nerd brain immediately goes to Vocaloid, which, is and was built on the idea of creating a vocal synthesizer that was completely free of needing an actual human to sing your songs for you.
Yeah.
And of course, it was made in Japan originally, and one thing about the Japanese language that makes it a bit easier to do something like that is that it's mostly syllabic in nature.
Yes.
The English language, we have a lot of different sounds, we have a lot of different phonics, and you absolutely can record like fragments of that and you can turn it into words, but you can't quite do it the same way you can with things like syllabic languages, where you can record each syllable and then combine them in a way that, works. But the interesting thing about Vocaloid is that it is often touted as kind of the first attempt to create a pop star that never dies, or an immortal pop star.
Right.
There's a very interesting video by Polygon on the internet, Polygon, the video game website, in which they discuss how the idea of having a virtual pop star is not only different from having a real pop star, but in many ways almost better. When you have this virtual pop star, it's someone you can objectify, you can do all of the stuff that you would do with a normal pop star, where you fangirl over them and we think about like Britney Spears and how she was stressed and she totally lost it.
Well, yeah, she's a human being.
She's a human being.
Beings grow older and they die.
Right. But, Vocaloids will never do that. They are voices that are pre-recorded.
Well, it's like the record company's, ideal pop star.
Yeah. No, it literally is. When Krypton released the Vocaloids to begin with, the first two that were released, Kaido and Mako, were fairly popular, and I shouldn't say the first. They were the first major Krypton Vocaloids that were released. But before that, they'd had things like Leon and Lola were actually the very first Vocaloids, and those were ones where it was like, they just wanted a voice they could put in some jazz tracks so that it would sound like there was someone kind of singing gently in the background, like a little jazz ditty. And as time went on, they got more advanced to the point where now they have many, many Vocaloids who can speak Japanese, English, German, Korean. There are hundreds of different vocal synthesizers and voice banks that can be used in music and sound almost human in many cases.
Are the syllables which are used for Vocaloids, do they originally come from humans, like a voiceover artist would be there going through every syllable in the dictionary and then they're just read into a computer, or are they completely synthesized?
There's actually kind of a little bit of both in that. So with main Vocaloids, let's say Hatsune Miku, who is the main one that most people are aware of.
Oh yeah, I know that name from, yeah.
For those who aren't aware of Hatsune Miku, she is an anime character and a virtual pop star, and she's very big in both the West and the East. She has long green pigtails, and she is completely virtual. She is, however, voiced by an actual human being. So Hatsune Miku is voiced by Sakiko Fujita, or better known as Saki Fujita, who's actually a very prominent Japanese voice actress. She's done a lot of work for different animes, dramas, all sorts of things.
Anything that I would recognize?
I would say the thing that you personally would recognize would be that in Assassination Classroom, she plays the digital student, whose name I cannot quite remember, but she is the character who is entirely a virtual student.
Yes, I remember that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioning that too now.
Because it's very ironic that, of course, the voice actress for a virtual pop star would also be playing a virtual teenager in an anime. Now, what's interesting is, yes, most of the popular Vocaloids are voiced by humans. However, there are and have been a few different attempts by Vocaloid and by Krypton and other companies to create Vocaloids that are entirely based off of synthesized sound. The one that comes to mind immediately is actually not technically a Vocaloid. It's called an Utao, which Utao is basically a free version of Vocaloid software, which is a little bit more open source and a little bit less advanced. So it's a little messier. But Utao Tane was the first, Utao, and she comes standard with any copy of Utao that you download. And her voice is entirely synthesized out of computer noises. She does not have an actual human voice. And it does lend it to sounding a lot different. It sounds very virtual.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can understand what she's saying, at least if you're a Japanese speaker.
I remember playing with an old Speak and Spill back in the late 70s that had early voice synthesis. And, it can be used not only to get across ideas, but also, I found it will add sometimes a creepy tone to things.
Definitely.
If deployed correctly.
For sure. I think a lot of songs have been able to successfully kind of use that type of thing to create that air, which is why also Vocaloid as a genre has come to be very closely associated with horror stories, because much of what Vocaloid started out with was people using that sound of synthesis, that sound of off-kilter radio kind of sound to create an eerie atmosphere. So if you ever are looking at kind of Vocaloid tracks and stuff, you'll find that a lot of them are horror themed. There's a lot that are about, kids getting lost in the woods, people dying, ghosts, murderous, rampages. And it's largely because of that dissonance, that sound of what? That's not human.
In the world of today's deep fakes, where we're starting to see video transformations where you can start to insert some actors' faces onto other actors and stuff like that, have you heard of such things happening from an audio perspective, like being able to recreate a dead person's voice or singing voice or anything along those lines?
I personally haven't heard of anything, but I almost guarantee that there's something out there that has tried to do that.
Right.
I know recently there was talk of, wasn't it in The Irishman or something, they brought back an actor or something and they...
Well, they de-aged a number of the actors.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Right. And I guess that that lends itself to talking a little bit about just some of the deep fakes that I've seen out there. I mean, the technology is amazing the way that it's come forward. Not only, as you mentioned, The Irishman, where they've de-aged some of the actors. Saturday Night Live member and impressionist Bill Hader appearing on various talk shows, and he'll occasionally slip into a line of an impression. But when he slips into the line of that impression, the person manipulating the clip puts the actor's face, who he is doing the impression of, over his face. So, Bill will slip into a few lines doing a Tom Cruise impression, and they'll put Tom Cruise's face over Bill's, and it's seamless. It's amazing.
That's fun.
One of my comedian friends who does impressions, there's actually things, I don't know how he does it. I haven't asked him yet.
Sure.
But he'll do impressions and then put the actor's face over his. If you'll remember the movie from the 90s, Forrest Gump.
Yes, absolutely.
Starring Tom Hanks. That was, I remember that got a lot of press back in the day for being one of the first movies to really kind of insert and manipulate dead people footage, in a sense, and have them interacting with some of the main characters in the movie. Now,
Yeah.
you look back on it and it's like, well, that was 25 years ago and it's obviously very primitive and you can, the seams are showing all over the place.
Sure.
But, it's like they incorporated John Lennon into an interview segment with Forrest Gump and President John F. Kennedy as well.
Yeah.
And they even put like Forrest Gump in the middle of that famous high school that they integrated in Alabama back
Little
in
Rock?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've been doing that for a while, but
Nice.
as the technology becomes better and better, I think it's just going to be more and more seamless.
Yeah.
And you will start to see, past performers start to crop up. Well, there have been holograms of
which there's
dead
another
performers.
Yeah, Vocaloid itself uses hologram technology. They have live concerts that you can go to, and you can see Vocaloids perform. There is no human up there. It is entirely hologram based. But you're right. It's fascinating how lifelike that can feel.
Yeah, some of that stuff was a huge deal at the time when I was growing up, even if it was extremely primitive. How do you think most of your contemporaries look at it now?
I think it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
I would say that, like, for instance, my brother Chris, who is, a few years younger than me, and he and I have very different personalities. He is very sporty, he's very outgoing and athletic, he's good with people, and of course I'm a huge nerd who spends all day in my room playing Animal Crossing, and, it's... But he has taught me that, people that are kind of in his circles see that stuff as this awesome technological innovation, like something that just continues to get better.
Yeah.
My generation uses a lot of Snapchat, and Snapchat has filters that can automatically recognize your face, and they can, like, juxtapose it on other things. They can change it so that your mouth is super big. They can just sorts of crazy
I've
stuff.
seen some of that stuff, yeah.
Right. And for us, it's normal to have that kind of thing. We send photos to our friends. My girlfriend, Grace, all the time will send me very cute Snapchats of her with those filters, just to be silly, just to be fun.
Yeah.
But I think there is a flip side to that kind of technology, which is kind of concerning, because we do live in a world where more and more we are worrying about surveillance and worrying about data and personal privacy. And with things like deepfakes and with things like edited video or edited audio, you begin to stumble upon the ethical question, can we reasonably continue to fake audio and video while also understanding that this is going to impact the credibility of real audio and video, in things like courts or, up against other people.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that my generation, being the old fogies that we are, have been worried about ever since the, fictional days and the real days of 1984.
Right.
Is that, what can this technology be used for? Funny enough, I collect old comic books, as you know. Well, one of the comic book series I read, and that has been anthologized fairly recently, was an old Daredevil comic book about one of his villains, kind of Daredevil is arguably a knockoff Batman. Well, here was one of his villains was a knockoff Joker named the Jester. And the Jester started manipulating New York City against Daredevil by putting together this fake footage of Daredevil saying these horrible, horrible things.
Yeah.
And, got the crowd all against him and stuff like that. So a very dystopian scenario from that perspective. Well, this came out in 1976.
Wow.
So it's like we've been thinking about that kind of stuff for a long time. And now it's starting to get to the point where it's like, well, they can actually do this pretty easily.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that. There's a very funny clip in one of the Scooby-Doo movies. I believe they were directed by Michael Myers, weirdly enough.
Well, I'm afraid...
Actually, I'm not sure who they were directed by, but it's... Whatever the case, the Scooby-Doo movies... there's a fantastic bit where Fred is talking and he's like, you're just trying to make people think that I think Coolsville sucks. And then it cuts to a news broadcast, and the news broadcast has said, and all Fred Jones had to say on the matter was, I think Coolsville sucks. And it really, obviously that's a good running joke, that idea of twisting somebody's words. But I think it also does bring into perspective, how ethical is it to bring people back from the dead? I play a lot of D&D. I play a lot of, fantasy, RPG type stuff. And in many of those games, you can, in fact, actually practice necromancy. And in many of those games, there is also often the ethical question posed, is it reasonable to bring people back to life? And if you do, to what extent do they need to be conscious to be considered, like, to what extent do they need to be sentient to be considered alive once more?
Right.
You know, versus, like, a zombie, per se.
Right. And I mean, that's when you open that Pandora's box about,
Right.
like, what is life and what is consciousness, and
Yeah.
things that we've been grappling with longer than we've been grappling with nerd topics.
Yeah, which I find it fascinating that, like, you know, this is nerd stuff. This is very much nerd stuff, but it does connect back to something that is, I think, a very, like, inherent human question.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I know that, you know, to kind of touch on what you were just talking about, there was kind of an uproar with one of these technologies wherein you can kind of, quote, bring someone back to life. If we remember the game Rock Band from
Yes.
a few years ago,
Yep.
I remember there being a bit of a furor about, you know, the fact that you can unlock different levels and have different bands play different songs.
Right.
And at one point you could, like, unlock Kurt Cobain and Nirvana
Okay.
and have them do, like, Journey songs. If I remember the exact thing correctly. And, you know, there was kind of an uproar like, look, Kurt hated Journey. It was against the corporate rock thing, was basically against everything he stood for.
Right.
And essentially, this is kind of like sacrilege to do this kind of thing.
Right.
So, and, you know, of course, there were many nuances to the argument and, you know, many back and forth. And I forgot what Courtney Love said about it, but I seem to remember she had a more enlightened viewpoint than you might think.
Yeah.
But, you know, that just, you're right, it opens up a whole can of worms.
Right.
You know, not only can you, but should you with all of this technology.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you know, speaking on video games in general, there's a lot of that in bringing people back, or even things like mocap and facial capture. So I work at GameStop, and I've worked at GameStop for a bit, and we have something called GameStop TV that likes to play as we work. It gives us updates on kind of like what's coming out and, you know, like what's going on in the game world, and mostly it's just commercials. But I do remember there was a segment that they did when Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the remake, came out. And that was the one that just came out last year. So that is actually a remake of the original Call of Duty Modern Warfare. When they remade it, there were a few challenges they came across. So they actually couldn't get back some of the original mocap actors, as well as a few of the original voice actors.
Oh, interesting.
Which, Call of Duty is a very insular community. Usually if you play Call of Duty, you kind of only play Call of Duty. There are very few, like, major gamers who I would say are also very invested in Call of Duty, just because, you know, it is very much a mainstream kind of game, and then if you want to really get into video games, there's a lot of better options.
Okay.
I'll just say it. There's better options. There are better things that you could be playing than
That
Call
is
of
your
Duty.
capsule review for the day.
Yeah, but what they couldn't bring back a lot of those original mocap and voice actors. So what they would do in these commercials is they would almost try to justify to the audience, like, well, sorry, we couldn't bring back this person, but we got this new person, and he's way better, and he sounds way better, you know. And it was always interesting to me that you could have this loyalty to something like a mocap actor to the extent that, like, people would be, and people were. I genuinely have heard people say to me, I'm upset that they didn't bring back this voice actor or whoever for Call of Duty Modern Warfare.
Well, and I think that maybe underlines a kind of point here, is that no matter how much the technology progresses, and no matter how much you're able to replicate a certain experience in a certain way, you know what? You're always going to be looking for that undefinable human element in a lot of ways. No matter how much you slice it, dice it, and put it into a new framework, you're gonna still be, you know, like when I listen to some music, I'm always going to be listening for certain things from certain artists. You know, the way they play the guitar, or the way they sing, or whatever the case may be.
So I have a question for you. If you were to theoretically find, like, like, you know how in Full Metal Alchemist they have those, like, the transmutation circles that they use? They're like those circles with all the sigils. So let's say you found one and it had some circles around it. I'm not going to tell you how many. And you knew that if you put some things in those circles, you'd be able to resurrect whoever it was that you were, like, putting things in the circles for. What do you think you would put on a transmutation circle to try and bring back someone from the dead?
Well, first of all, I probably wouldn't be messing around with necromancy. You know, we've seen Ghostbusters, we've seen
Full Metal Alchemist.
Full Metal Alchemist. It never goes well.
Yeah, there's no.
Never goes well.
Yeah.
So I would not do that. But are you asking me, like, who I would bring back or what I would use to bring them back?
What would you use to bring a human being back? What do you think would be the most key elements of a human being that you would need to bring them back? And it doesn't have to be physical elements. It could be things like their music, or maybe, a book that they wrote, or maybe you think their hair is important. I mean, what do you think makes a human a human?
Well, that's a really complicated question. I don't want to dodge it necessarily, but it seems like a very broad question. I mean, it's like,
is. For the sake of comedy, consider like what are 4 or 5 things that you think make up a human soul?
I would say their intelligence, their compassion, their wit, their but these are more qualities rather than objects.
Yeah.
I mean, I could go a certain obvious route and say, like, well, if I wanted to bring back John Lennon, I'd put one of his CDs in the circle or something like that. But who knows what that would bring forth, and that would only bring forth an aspect of his personality.
Right. It's interesting because I think in sort of a comedic fashion, you think about those parts of a human that make them who they are. And you think, okay, what's the nearest physical object I could tie to that trait, Right. So let's say it's somebody's, wit that you're trying to bring back. So maybe you put a crossword puzzle book that they completed when they were alive, or something like that. I like to
then you just bring back a pedantic grammar nerd.
Oh, God. Oh, Jesus. It's like, oh, man, I was trying to bring back Yoko, or she's not dead, is she?
Not as of this recording.
Okay, well, cool. Let's hope that doesn't change. But yeah, like, let's bring back John Lennon. We'll put a crossword book, and then it turns out it's some pedantic nerd.
Yes.
I don't like this bit. I don't like this question. This was so much different in my head. Whatever. Can't win them all, can you?
No, you can't. And that's why we have
editing. But that's okay. So what would you say are then some of examples of necromantic art, which you have noted and you find interesting, and that fit the topic at hand here? Weirdly enough, so this isn't actually a topic I have a ton of knowledge on, but it is very current, and I've found it kind of bizarre. So there's been a trend recently in anime, which is known as isekai anime, which from what I understand means like in another world, or like an anime that like displaces someone and puts them somewhere else, kind of an Alice in Wonderland situation. Okay. And a lot of
you have Thanos popping up in the middle of the 100-acre wood or something.
Yeah. So basically, what a lot of these anime are about is someone dying and being resurrected with all their memories in a completely different scenario. So I don't even know like any specific names, because all of them are these very long, very complex titles that are usually like, I was resurrected as the villain in an RPG for, nerds. And like, that's the whole title. And it's basically about that.
Sounds like we're getting into slash fic territory here.
A little bit. That is kind of definitely maybe the point of isekai anime, unfortunately. But I find it fascinating that especially recently that's been a huge like trend, is the idea of people like being resurrected in a world other than their own and having to figure out what they're doing and what the rules of this new world are. And it's kind of a curious way to explore, like, the perspective of the person being brought back from the dead, you know? It's maybe not the most academic way to explore it, but definitely interesting. And I have seen a couple of bits from isekai anime. I've seen some, clips and reviews and whatnot, and there are some very good ones. There are ones out there that people like very much and say are very, like, well-written and funny.
Is this fan-generated, or is it...
No, this is real. These are real animes that are put out by anime studios that are aired on, Crunchyroll and all these different anime websites. So, yeah.
Let me ask you, if you could resurrect, or if you could transport one character from, one form of media into another totally different background, is what do you think you would do? Oh,
that is a good question. I feel like it'd be interesting to take, like, a character from a Western story and put them into an Eastern-style story, like an anime type of situation, because... in the West, we take things very seriously.
Yes.
And so a lot of our movies and TV and media is very much about, like, like the deep feelings inside of you, or, like, being a man,
Yeah.
And recently, actually, I've been watching The Untamed, which if we want to get into necromancy, that's a very, very good example. But I've been getting into the Untamed, and one thing that really struck me when I started watching it was that they smile. The characters just smile. They smile at each other, they smile to themselves, they smile at situations, and everyone does. It's the men, it's the
like
women.
They're actual human beings.
And it feels more organic. It feels more authentic. You're watching it and you're like, oh, that's sweet. They had a nice moment. And I kept thinking, like, if this were a Western drama, these people would all just be angry at each other and skulking around and saying, like, one-liners, like, randomly to try and,
Yeah.
And it's very refreshing. So I would love to see, like a very gritty Western character get plopped into, like, a more emotionally aware kind of situation where it's like, hey, dude, like, do you want to talk about your problems? I don't want to talk about last time I talked about my problems, my whole family died. Well, that sucks, bro, but, like, you should probably get some therapy.
What are you sad about? Well, my family died. That's why I'm sad.
I would say that probably
That's
is where
probably
it started.
The main.
Yeah. So how about you? What do you think a good genre switch for you might be?
Well, this might be a cheap shot, but I'd kind of like to see Conan the Barbarian rampaging through the set of Barney the Purple Dinosaur.
Oh, good Lord, that'd be fun. Now, here I have a question for you. Are we assuming that the fiction of the universes we have drawn from is being preserved? Like, is Conan going to walk into the terrifying playground of Barney the Purple Dinosaur, and all of these kids are completely brainwashed and singing along, and Barney is actually a dinosaur rather than a pedophile in a suit? Like, what are we working with?
And see, that's where I think the interesting frisson comes in on these kinds of things, because but certainly that kind of switcheroo has been played with in the past.
Sure.
Many, many, many times.
No, it's not like Robot Chicken has done that 30 million
times. Yeah, exactly. I do like the idea of, you've got these brainwashed kids and this objectively evil purple dinosaur, just, maybe not the kids, but the dinosaur being hacked to bits by a sword-wielding barbarian.
Yeah. And I mean, it even brings into question, like, would Conan kill the children? What do you think Conan's take on...
Conan, I think, did have his own code of honor, so really,
okay.
I think he just enslaved them.
It's interesting when you try to think about preserving the fiction of a world like Barney, where it's like, it doesn't really have any fiction to preserve.
Yeah, and Barney isn't necessarily a good example, because it's not really a great example of world building.
Yeah, right. And it's interesting. I've had a lot of talks with my girlfriend Grace, and she sees media very objectively, whereas I tend to see it a bit more subjectively. So when she watches something, she'll take it at face value. And she doesn't analyze much about what the writers are doing or what, the voice actors are doing or the artists. I mean, she does to a certain extent, but for the most part, she just lets herself enjoy the fiction of whatever it is she's enjoying and take at face value what the writers have given her.
Right.
I used to think that was, like, a naive way to consume media, because I've always been very subjective, and I've always been very, critical of how the writers and the artists and the actors all work together. But recently, in talking to her, I've kind of realized there is a certain virtue to preserving that fiction and to letting yourself enjoy it for what it is.
Oh, yeah, suspension of disbelief, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. No, absolutely. And I mean, as I get older, I obviously get a little bit pickier on the kinds of things I consume, because I've consumed so much bad media in the past, so I want something better. But if I do find something which I think is worthy, I do like to just go with the world of it.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
I and that's what it's there for. That's what the enjoyment is for.
Right, and it's fascinating, because I think I definitely have that same view on things. And going back to, the idea of necromancy and kind of bringing things back, remakes of shows, of games, of music, of all sorts of things, where people will remake something with more modern technology, What do you feel like are some good, successful remakes versus maybe some unsuccessful remakes that you have seen in your life, and what kind of made them successful or unsuccessful?
That's a really, really good question, because any piece of art, you've got to have a solid foundation, a reason for doing it.
Yeah.
And, hopefully a decent reason. I mean, if money is your motivating factor, yeah, great, go out and sell some chocolate bars. But
go door to door with your little kitty wagon.
Right. But but it's you like to have a good artistic reason for doing it, and I find like the best remakes will either stay true to the original intent while expanding upon it, or open up a new take, a new avenue, which had not been thought of before.
Yeah.
So, I mean, going into the world of, say, comics, there's a classic example I can think of. I think most people who are even slightly familiar with comics is familiar with the name Alan Moore.
Yeah. Even I know that guy.
Even you know that guy, yeah. Co-creator of The Watchmen.
Yes.
Amongst and revitalizer of many, many comic series. But one of the great kind of revitalizations he did was on a character called what was originally called Marvel Man, but then for legal reasons had to be changed to Miracle Man.
Ah, interesting.
It was essentially a UK ripoff of Captain Marvel, Shazam.
Okay.
Very pulpy, 3-color adventures that were originally done back in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
His magic word instead of Shazam was Kimota, which is atomic spelled backwards. Yeah, I know. It's deep stuff. But when Moore revitalized it, he turned it really into a rumination on what some of the real life repercussions of having actual superheroes, gods among men, would be, and kind of retrofitted the whole history of Miracle Man to be a dream, not a dream, but kind of like an induced reality,
right?
Provided by his greatest archenemy.
I see. And like almost an illusion, kind of.
Almost an illusion. And it was, it got into this big storyline about how it was done using alien technology, and went into the backstories of all of the characters, but really brought them up to date and humanized them, and made them a parable for the way comic books had become by the 80s and then on into the 90s.
Wow.
So, I mean, it wasn't a strict remake by any stretch of the imagination, but it did definitely incorporate the original source material and expanded on it in ways which I'm sure the original creators had never foreseen.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think even like in comics, we think of Bucky Barnes, maybe the most famous resurrection of a comic book character as far as being successful, because, you see Bucky Barnes starting out as really just a minor character, a sidekick, like just, the plucky young Bucky Barnes friend.
Well, back in the 40s, the golden age of comics, kid sidekicks were kind of like the thing.
Right.
It's like air conditioning. You had to have it in your house.
Oh yeah. Well, and I mean, it's so interesting to me. Who was the guy who resurrected Bucky?
Oh, Ed Brubaker.
Ed Brubaker. Ed Brubaker has said that, like, one of the reasons he wanted to even bring Bucky back is because when he was a kid, he so much loved reading those comics and seeing Bucky and seeing himself in Bucky. And he was heartbroken when Bucky was just killed off in a footnote, But now we have the Winter Soldier. We have this character who has now become, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, he's very much well known.
He's getting his own TV show with the Falcon.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, it really goes to show you that I think you're right. With the right intent or with the right, if you have the heart behind it, you can resurrect something. You can resurrect a piece of media, and you can make it pretty fucking awesome.
Yeah, you can. And that's the good side of it. Of course, the bad side on the comic side, at least, is that in comics they resurrect everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody. The only exception thus far, I think, for Marvel Comics at least, is they have not resurrected Spider-Man's Uncle Ben.
Oh, thank God. It wasn't that the rule for the longest time? You can't bring back Uncle Ben, you can't bring back Bucky.
Right. And they obviously broke one of those.
Yeah, fucked it up.
I mean, he did it. Yeah, right. He did an amazing job, but still, it's like, well, how many dead people we got left now? Just one.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's true. And I mean, you think about, in a story, that's the purpose that death serves, it is often to create I think the tarot card death in the tarot deck, it does not actually signify physical death. It signifies the bringing on of a new experience, or the death of an old life and the bringing on of a new one.
Right.
And in stories, in media, the writers or whoever's creating it will use death as a way to show this is a moment for the characters in which they have to make a decision and they have to there's a turning point. This is their motivation, and so when you start bringing people back from the dead, you are not just bringing them back, you are also retroactively erasing part of the motivation for a character. And that can be very tricky to deal with. I think you can pull it off, and I think it has been pulled off. I don't think it's easy to pull off.
And when you talk about that, about changing motivations on things, it reminds me of one example that we're both familiar with from the Doctor Who universe. About 7 years back or so when they had the 50th anniversary of the show. And of course, Stephen Moffat, pause for booze and Rotten Tomatoes here, was putting that together. He tried to make it one of those great multi-doctor adventures where he got several iterations of the actor to come back. Tried to get the short-lived ninth Doctor, Christopher Eccleston, to come back on board. Christopher Eccleston revealed later that he wasn't interested because what Moffat was planning on doing was bringing back the Doctor's Lost World, Gallifrey.
Oh, good Lord.
And Christopher Eccleston was like, well, that negates the entire point of my character because his character was the world-weary war veteran, essentially.
No, he was coming right out of his world being destroyed. I mean, he was entirely based on the grief he felt from leaving behind all of his people.
So you can see where that kind of necromancy, if you will, the kind of bringing back of something either for fan service or for fictional reasons, it can trample or destroy an older part of the canon or the mythos.
Right, for sure. And that's why I think it's interesting and kind of important to have those kind of rules when you're writing of like, okay, we're not going to bring this person back and we're not going to do this, we're not going to touch this.
Yeah.
Because there are certain things that are sacred when you're writing that you have to just leave alone. No matter how painful they are, no matter how frustrating.
Yes.
Sometimes you have to write a character being a dickhole. And that's just because it helps to advance the plot. And even if you don't want to see that character be mean to other people or do something horrible, it's a part of life. We do it as humans, and
right. And and I mean, sometimes yes, you get a Winter Soldier situation where you get something amazing coming from it, but more often than not, you get what's called a Dallas situation. And you were definitely too young to remember this, but Dallas was a famous soap opera back in the 80s.
Yes.
If you've ever heard the old phrase "Who shot JR?"
I have. Yeah.
Yeah, that was like the big catchphrase throughout the summer of 1980 because they left the first season of Dallas on a cliffhanger. Someone shot the big anti-hero J.R. Ewing.
I see.
But anyway, that said, a few seasons down the road, one of the actors, Patrick Duffy, he's like, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to be a part of this show anymore.
Yeah.
So he left. Well, whether in a fit of pique or for writers' reasons, they actually killed off his character in the show. Like, okay, well, that closes the door for him coming back.
Yeah.
Well, flash forward a year to, perhaps Patrick Duffy's career is not going too well outside the show. And he's like, you know what, I'd really like to come back on the show. And the writers are like, okay, well, we got to find a way to bring him back.
Yeah.
Because we very, very much killed him off.
He's a little bit dead.
Yeah, a little bit dead. So, in one of the famous turnabouts in television history, at the, I don't know if it's at the end or the beginning of one episode, he steps out of the shower to see his wife, and he realizes, and the wife has realized, oh my God, the entire last season was all a dream.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God.
So they reintroduced him by essentially wiping out a year of continuity.
I'm almost disappointed just from you telling me that. I can't even imagine if you had been watching that live. I would have shit myself. I would have said, like, I feel like at the time, it's the 80s or whatever, like, I'm a housewife or something, and I write, like, a strongly worded letter to the Dallas people, like, how could you do this?
How could you do it? Then you put a physical stamp on it, and you put it in the post office box, and 6 to 8 weeks later, you
just like an old person. Just like an old person. But it's true, the idea of resurrecting characters and doing it in kind of a way that is just not, like, not well done, Anyways, but it's fascinating to me that, like, we can keep doing that. And we can, one remake for me that was kind of a mixed bag was Ghostbusters 2016.
Oh, yeah.
You know better than anyone how much I loved that movie. I went to go see it 6 times in theaters.
Yes.
I enjoyed it immensely. I had a hugely fun time. It was great to see all those actors up there. And I have very mixed feelings on it as a remake, because I do love the original Ghostbusters very much,
Right.
and it is it is a strong pillar of not only my, like, childhood and my nerdness, but also of, like, many people my age.
Oh, yeah. Or many people my age.
Right.
I went to see the original 5 or 6 times in the theater.
Yeah, and it's, it's interesting because the new one was very funny. It was very, like, well written. They had some great characters. They had some cool cameos. It was a fun story. Was it a perfect remake? Absolutely not. There was a lot that was very kitschy. There was a lot of sponsor plugs. They clearly, for the soundtrack, they were like, all right, what famous bands can we get? And most of them ended up being like teen punk bands, which kind of worked, but also hearing 5 Seconds of Summer sing about ghosts was kind of a weird, like, it just doesn't sit the way...
Well, I like me some 5 Seconds of Summer, but they're no Ray Parker Jr., I'll tell you that.
None of us could ever
None of
be
us
Ray
could
Parker
be Ray
Jr.
Parker Jr.
Who you gonna call?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, but it's true. And, it is one of those things where you can tell that there was a lot of love and a lot of heart going into it, and that they were coming from a place that was probably pretty fun. I mean, most of the cast was SNL alums or people who are, like, pretty well known in the acting world. It was very much kind of a, like, collaboration show between a lot of very big names.
Yeah.
That, however, also does sometimes cause a little bit of issue, because if you have all these big names, it then becomes about, well, what big actors, what big singers can we get in, rather than, like, what's the story about? What are we, what are we putting in here?
That's an expansion of a topic for another time, just in the sense that, a lot of course, major motion pictures are driven by corporate concerns and sponsorship and synergy between various intellectual properties. So it's
just throw in some more buzzwords there, Dad.
Yeah, right. Yeah, being as I was reading in the Hollywood Reporter.
No, it's true though.
So, but yeah, I mean, it's like it's different. It's a different movie experience because these things are kind of tooled up to be commercialized selling machines to a certain extent.
Yeah, you're very right. So, did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on here? Anything else you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I think not on this particular topic. I mean, certainly, I think we've also exposed a few tangential threads, which will be interesting to follow up on in further episodes. So, how about yourself?
I think I'm pretty good. I think we've talked a lot about bringing back people from the dead, which is not something I expected to be talking about today.
Yeah, well, it is Sunday, so it's the Lord's Day. So.
Oh, yeah.
He's in Christian theology. There is precedent for that.
This is very true.
Yeah. So there you go. Now it's time for Stump the Dad. Stump the Dad. Stump the Dad. Yeah. It is that time of the week. It is time for Stump the Dad.
Yay!
Yay! This is the weekly segment wherein I've given Cal a list of band names, obscure band names, and she's going to pick 3 off the list and ask me about them one by one, and I'm going to give her a brief history of these bands. Now, some of them are not real. Some of them are fictional.
Aww.
But I'm going to give her a detailed backstory regardless, and then she has to figure out
if they're real or not.
That's right.
All right. Yeah. Well, Dad, to start us out, I have some questions.
Mm-hmm.
That's not related to this. I just have a lot of questions.
Okay.
But related to this, I would like to hear, what is the story behind Quint Weekly and hemp?
Ah, yes, Quint Weekly and hemp. This is where we dive into my love for 60s music, as well you know. So Quint Weekly was a member of the original Electric Prunes.
Okay.
And that is a story in and of itself.
Yeah, the name itself would require years to fully come to terms with.
I think that, in all seriousness, I think one of the band members for the Electric Prunes was asked about, how they came up with their name. And this was, the psychedelic era. So it's like all kinds of weird names. And it was like a joke, like, what's purple and hums? And
oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, okay,
Electric Prune.
Right, exactly. I didn't say it was a good joke, but... So anyway, Quint Wakely was one of the members of the early Electric Prunes. I think he was the rhythm guitarist. I can't say definitively.
Okay.
But as happens in bands and whatnot, they kind of splinter and form new bands and whatever the case may be. So the Electric Prunes initially saw some success in the U.S. With their song I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night, which is a classic garage rock song which is included in the groundbreaking Nuggets anthology from the early 70s.
Wow.
So they had a big national hit, and they actually toured like Europe and all that stuff on it. Well, at that point, artistic differences and that kind of thing. So Quint struck out on his own and put together his own group. Now, at this point, of course, we're getting into the later 60s. So around like 1968 and whatnot, you were starting to see things like communal living
yes.
crop up and all that kind of thing. So Quint forms a new band based on, he moves to a commune.
Yes. Okay.
Like in Northern California. I forget exactly where it was. Moves to a commune in Northern California, and just kind of as part of the hippie lifestyle, kind of a group coalesces around him.
Interesting.
So now, to everyone else, he was kind of like big time LA musician, amongst this band of freaks and what have you. So he does manage to get a group together, and he does land a record contract, but not with like a major label or anything like that. It's one of these like minor labels.
Right.
But even though he did not achieve any commercial success, he made a series of increasingly more psychedelic / out there albums over the next few years, living on this commune and being with these people. Now, as with living on a commune, there was like some kind of centralized religious figure, one of the guys, and later there, it broke up acrimoniously in the early 70s because this guy was like one of those cult leader type of people. But nonetheless, they have these very highly sought after albums, which are extremely psychedelic and freaky.
Wow.
We're talking about like if you were to be able to find an original pressing of these, it would cost you like upwards of $1,000.
Wow.
For each one.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So but there are people who specialize in that kind of music.
Yeah.
But it was kind of groundbreaking in the sense that it was very much part of the DIY hippie counterculture movement, and some of the songs like his combo has been name checked by like a lot of underground musicians after the fact, like when the Paisley Underground came around in the mid 80s, and we're talking about bands like the 3 O'Clock and Dream Syndicate and stuff like that. To be hip, people would drop the name of like, oh yeah, Quint Weekly and Hemp, and that's kind of what started the ball rolling again. And of course, as you know, I am a peruser of Ugly Things magazine.
That's a weird way to say nerd, but okay.
Yeah. Which is about all the minutia of all these forgotten bands from the 60s. Quint and company have definitely come on that radar.
Okay, for sure.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't even have any questions for this one. It's real. There's no way it's not real. There's no way you just came up with this.
Okay, well, Quint Weekly and Hemp is fake.
Are you fucking me? Are you this is just gonna happen every time. You're gonna stump the shit out of me. I don't even know why this is called Stump the Dad. This should be called Stump the Cow.
Stump the Cow. Yeah, really.
Fuck you.
I was thinking about that. Though, to be fair, some of the things which I said about are true about several other bands. The whole thing about the Electric Prunes, absolutely true.
Okay.
There was a dude named Quint in the Electric Prunes at one point. There was also a guy named Weasel Spagnola who was in the band at one point. So.
I need to meet this man immediately. I don't care if he's dead. I want to go to his gravesite and I want to just look at his gravestone and go, Nice.
Yeah. Well, and there are lots of private press late 60s LPs that do go for hundreds or thousands of dollars, and that have been influential on other musicians throughout the years.
Okay.
I kind of modeled that story a bit on something, the Yahovah cult, which I've seen listed, which I've not actually heard their music, but they're one of those, like, oh my God, they used to sell their records in like health food stores back in the day.
Wow.
And now you'd have to, sell your kidney to get one of their albums.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's not real. Jesus. Now I want to listen to Quint Weekly and Hemp. I don't even want to listen to any of the bands you based it off of. I just want to listen to Quint Weekly and Hemp.
You know what? I'll mock up something for you.
Put together some Quint Weekly and Hemp albums for me.
Yeah, man. Yeah, mastered from the original scratchy 8-track cartridges.
Hey, man, I gotta say, like, you were talking about it's super rare and hard to find Quint Weekly and Hemp albums, so, like, you weren't wrong.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I will say there are probably not any specialists who would be able to find a Quint Weekly and Hemp album, but...
Though it would be awesome if someone were to hear this podcast and only hear part of it and become obsessed
with Quint Weekly and Hemp.
Finding Quint Weekly and Hemp and be like, I must make this my life's goal.
I must find them.
That would be awesome.
That would be hilarious.
And this has been From X to Z.
Woo! Thanks for listening, guys.
We'll catch you next time.
From X to Z was written and hosted by Alan Morgan and Cal Morgan. From X to Z is a production of Memoriam Development.